This week, a bit of a one-off Advent lesson that was separately prepared for you. I know April sent out the lesson ahead of time. It's not in our regular material. It's one that I think, would have got to last year, but for lack of time, had to cut it out. So we've Christmas lesson next week, and to prepare during this time of Advent, we have an important Advent lesson, the account of Joseph. Mary tends to get most of the attention, and rightfully so. In the Gospel of Luke, we get the story of the angel coming to Mary and the announcement that she would have the Christ child. Sometimes overlooked what goes on with Joseph. For that, we actually have to get to a different gospel. Gospel of Luke is where we spend most of our time in the Advent and Christmas season, at least as far as the Gospels go. But Matthew has some important stuff that's not in Luke. Fairly certain Luke, actually, years after the fact, talked to Mary. We know that Mary was still alive and well after Jesus ascended into heaven. And in fact, there's a brief reference in the book of Acts to the believers meeting in her house. Whereas Joseph, whatever happened to him, most likely he perished prior to Jesus beginning his earthly ministry. There often was quite an age difference between grooms and brides back then. I mean, the whole way they did marriage is quite different to our culture, and that has some relevance to understanding the story here in Matthew's gospel. Um, a man would become independent and established over a number of years, and at that point, then he would seek a bride. Only after reaching a certain age of maturity would he get married, and so the bride that he would seek then usually was a young woman. Actually, in our culture, would still be considered a girl. Usually teenagers. Yeah, when they're old enough to bear children, they would they would be betrothed to a groom. So you would have an age difference, sometimes 20 years, maybe even more. And that is one reason, by the way, why there's so many widows in the New Testament. Women tend to live longer anyway, and then you give the men a 20-year head start, you're going to end up with a whole lot of widows. And in a culture where widows really can't take care of themselves, now you have a little bit of a social problem. And so that's why the early church, actually, the care for widows was a awfully important ministry in those days. And Mary, quite certainly, one of those widows as well at some point in her life. The other thing about betrothal back then, these were arrangements. Often there would be someone actually given the job to arrange marriages. Sometimes families would know each other, and actually from years that these marriages would be arranged, and you'd have a baby who would be born, a baby girl, and the parents would already say, "Oh, when this girl's old enough, she's going to marry so and so." Might seem weird to our culture. You know what? In their culture, it worked. I mean, I'm not saying every marriage was happy, but I mean, how about how are the divorce rates in our culture, right? Is it necessarily worse to have arranged marriages? The Jewish culture, it was uh, understood that at the center of a marriage would be God, and so yeah, in many of these marriages, you'd have people who maybe didn't know each other that well, but they knew God. Both of them knew God, and that allowed them to work through whatever differences or difficulties they may have had. And it does seem that in these arranged marriages, it's not that they're loveless. It's clear to me, anyway, from this text that Joseph did love Mary. He, prior to their marriage, he knew her, not in the biblical sense, I guess you could say, but he appeared to have a genuine love for her, which motivated a decision that he made to divorce her quietly. Now you might say, wait a minute, how can he divorce her if they're not married yet? Well, that's the other thing that is a little different in this culture back then. The engagements in our culture are pretty serious when you, especially if you pony up for an expensive engagement ring, right? But back then, an engagement was a seal of marriage. It was a legally binding agreement the two parties would enter into, And although it was not consummated, that would be after the wedding ceremony that the bride and groom would become intimate for the first time, and that was when they were officially husband and wife. But the engagement itself was also a solemn, legally binding agreement that was to be entered into and was by no means to be treated lightly or broken with. And if there was any kind of an affair, that would be considered adultery. And you know how seriously adultery was taken in Jewish law. In Jewish law, it was a capital offense. Now, it's a little bit of a misnomer. Sometimes you hear people saying Joseph could have had Mary killed. Technically, yes. Theoretically, yes. But most probably, the Roman law would have intervened. And this is actually one of the issues when that woman who was caught in adultery in the Gospel of John, when they bring her to Jesus and ask what should be done with her, they wanted to kind of try to pit together the Roman law and the Jewish law. The Roman law most likely wouldn't have allowed an execution over adultery. Romans had some rather different ideas about sexual ethics. They were a whole lot more libertine than the Jewish law. But anyway, not to minimize, this would have been considered a very serious offense, and whether Mary could have been killed or not by Joseph legally, she certainly could have been subject to public scorn and humiliation and rejection and isolation. You know, she would have had a reputation that would have followed her all the days of her life and resulted in her never being able to get married and never being able to be accepted into the community as a worthy member of the community, because it would have been a quite a taboo to become pregnant by another man while engaged. Actually, it would have been a taboo to be pregnant by the man you were engaged to. Yeah, times have changed a bit, not necessarily for the better, but in Mary's day, Joseph could have had her ostracized to a tremendously devastating extent. However, he had resolved not to. Being a just and righteous man, Joseph, when he found out Mary was pregnant and he knew with 100% certainty that this was not his baby, he decided he was just going to keep it on the down low, quietly divorce, break off this engagement with Mary, send her on her way. Do you think Joseph felt good about any of this? Now, there's this one little brief passage in Matthew that talks about Joseph considering these things, or depending on your translation, Joseph is thinking. Probably a whole lot more than just thinking casually, more like obsessing, trying to make sense out of this. How could things go so wrong? And at the core for me, the story of Joseph and his encounter with the angel here is a story of how to think about expectations. Joseph had a set of expectations when he got engaged. Joseph's expectations were not met. And initially, as any of us in that situation would have assumed, the expectations were not met because somebody else has wronged him, somebody else has hurt him. Now, this is something I think we can all identify with to some extent. We have expectations for how others treat us. And these expectations are sometimes we set them too high, but more often than not, our expectations are really rather minimal how other people should treat us. Just treat me with a little bit of respect here, right? Treat me with some consideration, treat me with dignity. If and yeah, once you have a closer relationship with somebody, those expectations go up a bit more than just the minimal treat me with respect. It's like treat me with love. If you're a spouse, you would expect your spouse to treat you lovingly, even to treat you sacrificially, to put your needs above their needs. Certainly to not commit adultery. That was one of the expectations that Joseph had, and an expectation today that I hope any spouse would have of their spouse. Yeah, the expectations that Joseph had were not unreasonable at all, and the expectations we have for how others treat us, usually not too unreasonable. And yet, despite our reasonable expectations, how often are they not met? How often are our expectations disappointed by how others fail to treat us the way that we deserve or the way that we would like? And so, what do we do about this? Well, let's think about what God's situation was when he put a tree in a garden. So don't eat this. If you love me, you will not eat this. Just such a minimal expectation, right? And that minimal expectation was not met. And to this day, we continue to fail to meet God's rather minimal expectations. He doesn't ask more of us than he doesn't ask an unreasonable set of behaviors and conditions for us. And yet we continually disappoint him. We continually fail to meet his rather basic minimal expectations for a loving relationship that a creature ought to have toward his or her creator. And so, what does God do in his disappointment? He forgives us and he sends us grace and he sends us peace. Mind blowing. Joseph didn't fully comprehend this at the time, but the angel came to him, and the angel announced what was really going on with Mary's pregnancy. Once Joseph had this dream, the angel told him, "This is good news, actually. This is not your expectations." But you know what? You were thinking too low, buddy. You would not have expected that you would be married to the woman who God picked out of all the women on the face of the earth in order to bear the Son of God in a manger. This is not your expectation. The fact that he's born in a manger is not your expectation, too. Joseph's expectations are completely subverted. God gives a love that he just would not expect, a blessing that he would not expect. Who would expect this random dude from Palestine in the first century? I'd be talking about him into my laptop one day, 2,000 years later. This is just mind blowing that Joseph gets this privilege and this honor. And we, for all of our expectations, God comes to us and says, I got stuff for you that you would never even expect. For us now, yeah, maybe you can look at your life and say, I never would have believed that I would have gotten these blessings. I hope you're at that point. I hope you can look at your life and say, I never thought God would bless me this good. My expectations were too low. He has exceeded my expectations. But maybe that's not you. Maybe you look at your life and say, I expected better. Guess what? Praise be to God through Christ, through that baby who was born to Mary. He is preparing for you a future that blows your expectations out of the water. So, our expectations can be disappointed. Joseph certainly were. But God is coming along and he is preparing something that exceeds our expectations because he, in his disappointment and his unmet expectations, managed to say, I am still going to bless, I am still going to give grace, I am still going to give peace. This is what Joseph, even before the angel, this is what Joseph said to Mary. My expectations are not met, but I am still going to give you love. In the form of a divorce, this is still the most loving thing Joseph can do at this point. I'm going to give you grace, I'm going to give you peace. And then after the angel comes, then Joseph says, okay, I am going to marry you now that I know the real circumstances involved here. Knowing the circumstances, knowing God's gifts are going to exceed our wildest expectations, this allows us to deal with unmet expectations. This allows us to give grace and love and forgiveness to people who don't meet our expectations. So somebody has wronged you. Somebody has not treated you the way that you deserve. Is this okay? No. At the same point, God has intervened in your life. He has given you blessings and grace and mercy through Jesus Christ. And now you are free to give forgiveness to that person who has not met your expectations. You are free to give peace and mercy and grace to those who have wronged you, because you've wronged God, and He has nonetheless given you beyond your wildest expectations. Hope that makes sense, and I hope that's something that you can communicate to the kids about this wonderful story about Joseph and his willingness to give grace and peace. And may we also at this Christmas season give grace and peace even to those who fail to meet our expectations. What does the story tell us about God and His mercies? I guess we already handled most of these questions here. God, in His grace and mercy, has given us peace and given us love, even when we have not met His expectations. These are His tender mercies. What does the story say about who we are as God's people? says that he's got a plan for us, just as he had a plan for Joseph, a plan that we wouldn't necessarily work out, but a plan that wouldn't go to our script, the way that if Joseph had to write a script for his life, he never in his wildest dreams would have wrote down what was written for him by his God. And the same goes for us as God's people. We have we have a future to live, both now and in eternity, which God has prepared for us ahead of time to walk in. And what does the story tell us about how to live as God's people in your disappointment, in your anguish? Joseph was in anguish over people who have harmed you, wronged you, and failed to meet your expectations. Give mercy, give peace, give grace, give love, give forgiveness. So I think that covers it. Blessings on your lesson, on the preparations for the Christmas program, and for all of your Advent and Christmas preparations this year.